Greetings, and welcome to the Bowling Green First United Methodist Church. We hope that you enjoy what you're about to see, and you can find us on the corner of Broadway and Church Streets at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings. Or you can find us at bgmethodist.org and on Facebook at Bowling Green First United Methodist Church. So we are finishing this morning kind of this the series we've been doing on our Methodist history, and we're going to get us from up to the point where we become the United Methodist Church this morning, and this is a really important question. And are we yet alive? This, except that it's been a long week, and I wasn't necessarily thinking as clearly as I wanted to at the beginning of the week. We would have sung that song earlier today, but I got myself all mixed up. But that song, Are We Yet Alive, the song that gets sung and has been sung in every annual conference that we've had. This isn't one of Wesley's questions that he asked, but this is in the spirit that Wesley would speak and he would talk, and this is in the this is the way he's asking: Are you good? Are you alive? Are you alive with the Spirit going forward? Do you see God's hope and promise going forward from this place? And that's where we are looking towards this morning. And we're going to do that in going forward, though we've got to remember where it is that we come from and how we have kind of gotten to this place. That's why it's been really good that we've been looking at our history. And this morning we're just going to kind of take a quick look at where we started. We're going to look back at John Wesley, and I've got a video that's going to play that's going to show Wesley and Francis Asbury, the first bishop that we had in America, the first really American bishop. Even though he was English, he was basically American by the time he was ordained and then elected to bishop, and many others. This video is played now. It's becoming a tradition for our conference every year at the ordination service when we get ready to ordain those new folks for ministry. Those folks that have answered God's call to pastor and to preach or to serve the church in a special way, and now are being ordained. We play this video. Sometimes some of the names change, but it goes from Wesley down from generation to generation to generation. And then you'll see our current Missouri Bishop, Robert Schnese, who will be on there. And then as he then ordains this year's class of elders and deacons. And elders are folks like Dr. Mike, who are called to serve the church as pastors and as preachers, who have received extra education and extra training to do that. And deacons serve the church in a different way. Sometimes they will preach, but they don't do the sacraments. They don't do baptism. They don't do communion. They won't do weddings. But they serve a very special purpose. In our Mark Twain district here in northeast Missouri, we have a couple of deacons, one in Macon and one up in Kirksville, and both of them actually are youth ministers. And they are serving the church in that way. As you look throughout the state of Missouri, we have deacons that serve as music ministers, as social workers, as administrators, and any number of different ways. They are called to serve the church in a very special and specific way. And so we call them deacons as they go to serve out God's call in their life. So I want to invite you to see what we see at annual conference, but what reminds us of where we have come from and then getting us to today. it's important for us to look back sometimes on where we've come from. And to remind ourselves of where we started and kind of one of the ways in which we got to where we are today. Because that does something very important for us. That takes us and that helps us to remember who we are, to remember our purpose, to remember what it is we are called to be doing. Because that's one of the things when we come into times of conflict and confrontation and struggle and hardship, whether as in our individual lives or as a church or as a denomination or as a nation, one of the first things we begin to lose in the process of that is we lose our identity. We lose who we are. We begin to lose that sense of self and purpose that we have because it gets consumed by so many other things that are going on around us. And sometimes we've got to stop and take a look back at where we've been and how we got here to help remind us of who we are. We see that in our history as a denomination. Remember last week when we finished up, we finished up here. You may not be able to read that completely all the way from back there, but this was where when John Wesley sent first Francis Asbury and then Thomas Coke to come over and start this church. We started in one place, and then by the time we get to the time of the Civil War, this is where we were. We had kind of fractured and separated, and we had split off in lots of different directions, and we were struggling to regain that sense of purpose, that sense of identity, that sense of who we were. And there's a couple of different ways that we can go from here. In the yellow, you see kind of one response to this. This are the Black Methodist churches that branched off from our main Methodist church and started their own churches. Now they did something important. They were doing something new. And in the process of doing that, they found their own identity. They found a new identity. And they got that things kind of firmly planted underneath them, and they were able to establish themselves and kind of get started. And many of them are still around today as churches and as denominations, and they are still doing lots of great work and reaching lots of great people. But they were able to find that place, find a new foundation that they can move from. We look at in red down there below that. That's our main part of the Methodist Church. When we split, we talked last week about how it was hard coming through the Civil War, and then even after the Civil War, we were still conflicted and fighting with each other, and still trying. We were still trying to figure out what are we doing, who are we in the midst of this time. And by the time we get to the end of the 1800s, the first part of the 1900s, we pretty well stopped fighting with one another, which was good. All three branches were growing. The Northern Church, the Southern Church, the Methodist Protestant Church, were all doing well and were growing, and they had their struggles and their hardships, but we were making progress, but we hadn't really yet found that identity. We hadn't found our own place. And so we begin to see towards the end of the 1800s, and especially the first part of the 1900s, there is this long arc that is beginning to take shape that is working on bringing all these folks back together. And there were lots of different ways that this story began to take place that we're going to bring back together these different branches of the church. Now there's a couple of interesting stops along the way before we get there, though, that we see, maybe that we see a lot are good for us to know that this is where, as Methodists, we are. One of those stops is here. Now there are lots of guys my age out there that would love to have a beard like he does. That's a great beard he's got. That is Dr. Thomas Welsh. And he was a Methodist preacher, he was a dentist, and he was also an active part of the temperance movement. This was in the late 1800s, and Methodists were very, very active in the temperance movement at that time, and he said we've got kind of a problem. We have lots of folks who are saying alcohol is bad, no alcohol, with one big exception. That was on Sunday mornings for communion because there was no alternative to wine. And so we'd have wine with communion, or worse, there were many churches that wouldn't have communion at all because they weren't going to have any alcohol, and well, figure something else out. And so he figures out a way to pasteurize unfermented wine. I think that's even what he called it, unfermented. Dr. Welch's unfermented wine was what he called it. And pasteurizing that, it didn't really take off so much with him, but his son who would come after him, Charles Welch, would begin to package it and sell it, and it's what we come today known as Welch's grape juice. That is, every time you see one of those on a store shelf, that's had it started in the Methodist Church way back in the day. Now, there's another group up here, another picture we're going to show that Retta has been after me for a while to show. She's shaking her head now going, it's about time you got there. This is, if you've ever been up to Washington, D.C., and you go up onto Capitol Hill, this is the United Methodist building. It is the only non-governmental building on Capitol Hill. It was purchased by a church board back in 1917. This was the board for temperance, prohibition, something else, and moral behavior, right? It had this long name for it, but these were the folks that were actively involved in the temperance movement. They bought the land in 1917, started building the building in 1922, it was finished in 1923, and has been there ever since. It has become, through that time, we've gone through lots of changes. It's now a part of the General Board of Church and Society. I think I got that right. As part of one of our general agencies in the United Methodist Church. And it has been the site of lots of different things over the years. Places where marches have started or ended, protests have started and ended, lots of meetings on lots of different issues have taken place there. It has been a place where the church has been able to help influence and talk about and bring to bear issues that are important to people of faith. It was even the place back during the first President Bush's term where the folks who were working on drafting legislation for the Americans with Disabilities Act were meeting. And in fact, the then President Bush sent a representative over to meet in the Methodist building so that this legislation could be drafted and put together. It serves an important role. It's an important place that we have as a church that says we're here and we are active and we want to be a part of what it is that's going on around us. But I'm kind of getting ahead of the story though. Because that's an important place for us, but a lot of its history comes after we do some other things. Because we look at this and we talk about that kind of long arc that we had, where we began to come back together. We began to finally figure this out about 1939. We kind of got ourselves worked together and we said, you know what, it's taken us a while, but we really are better together than we were apart. We've realized that our differences really weren't that big, that we could accommodate them and figure them out. Some of the decisions we made in coming together were better than others, and that's a whole longer discussion for later. But we did it. We did something that is very unusual. We came back together in 1939 as the Methodist Church. But we're still just the Methodist Church at that point. There's another piece of the story. Do you remember this picture from several weeks ago? There is Francis Asbury when he was being ordained as bishop. And standing there in that picture also was William Philip Otterbein, who was part of the United Brethren Church, and who was the founder of that church, is standing there. And the Brethren Church, and also the Evangelical Association, who would also have a branch that would come out of them called the Evangelical Church. Those two groups were very Methodist. Or very Wesleyan, I should say. They used the Methodist Book of Worship and lots of the same parts of the discipline that we use, lots of the same similar beliefs and structure and everything else. They just were kind of reaching different groups of people that were settling in the United States at that time. But they were very Wesleyan in their intent and their focus. And these two groups, the Evangelical Association and the Brethren Church, they would eventually, in 1946, they would come together and they would form the Evangelical United Brethren, or EUB, and they would form this new church, and they would stay as a church for 20 years until we see this last thing happen, which was in 1968. You've seen all these pieces I've been putting up the last couple weeks. Here's where that whole chart that it's from. And I know you can't read it, but I want you to see something that's important on there. That's all the places where we branched off, something really important happened that is very unusual in church history, which is we came back together. In 1968, the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren combined and we became the United Methodist Church. And whenever you look at a family tree of churches, most of you see churches branch off, they keep branching off or branching off or branching off. That we came back together is really unusual. That's not something that happens, really. When we're separate, we're separate. But we came back together because we saw something that was important. And we saw something that was important. There's two different ways we can respond. We can either find ourselves and find our identity in the place where we are and start something new, which is what we see with the churches in yellow, and not just them, but several other churches that you may recognize. The Nazarene Church, the Assemblies of God, the Holiness Church, and several others are branches off of our Methodist Church also. And they also have found kind of their place and their own identity, and they need a new thing going forward. But we can also find healing, and we can find reconciliation, and we can find ways of coming back together when maybe we can't figure it out on our own, but we can come back together, and now we find ourselves, and we find what it was that we had been missing. Because too often we're stuck kind of at this question. The psalmist writes, I raise my eyes toward the mountains. Where will my help come from? That's the question we have. Where will my help come from? But it's not just a question. It's also a statement that says, where will my help come from? Because I don't know where I am right now. Whatever it is that I am facing, that I'm dealing with, that I'm struggling with, the situation I'm in, the conflict that's taking place, I don't know where I am or I don't know who I am right now at this moment, and I need help. And then the psalmist answers that question in verse 2. He says, my help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. This is the place where our help comes from. This is the direction that we need to look. Now, this is not easy, though, because many of you are like I am, which is I've been by myself for far too many years, and Emily's still got a long time before she gets some of this trained out of me. And that's that I'm a very independent person. I like to, if something is wrong, I want to fix it. I want to take care of it. I don't want to look for any other help. I'm like, I got to take care of that thing. I can't leave that to someone else. That's my problem. I got to fix it. That's what we do. We either, on the one hand, we either ignore something. So it's out of sight, out of mind. If I don't see it, it doesn't see me kind of mentality. Or we say, I'm going to fix it. Sometimes we can't do either one of those things. Those things aren't going to get us very far because we have to remember that this is where our strength comes from. This is where our help comes from. This is where the knowledge and the help that we need to find that identity comes from. It starts with God. The God who leads us and guides us and strengthens us and helps us through these difficult times. Especially right now in our nation, we are facing this conflicted time where it's hard and it's difficult, and we have so many different competing sides that are seemingly just constantly butting heads against one another, and everyone's saying, well, you're over here, or you're over here, or you're over here, or you're over here, and that's really too simplistic to see what's going on, because all of these things, you can be all of them at once, and it is hard to find our way through. So how do we do that? We start first with prayer, but sometimes we get ahead of ourselves in prayer. We say, God, I need your help, and I really want you to do this. That's not how God works. Every time I've tried to tell God, this is exactly what I want you to do, God just kind of grins at me and says, I don't think so, John. Be patient, give it a second, and then we're going to see what happens next. Sometimes our prayer needs to be first and foremost just to say, God, it's hard. We don't know what to do. Everything is really complicated, and we're being pulled in all these different directions. Maybe I just need some patience and space so that I can begin to hear for that help that comes from God. Sometimes that needs to be our first prayer. And then the second most important thing we can do is we can begin to talk to the folks that are around us and have real conversations. Because too often our conversations, they look like this. Those aren't the conversations that help. And to have real, meaningful conversations, because we have to remember that sometimes the help that we receive from God is that God has put people in our lives or put people in our paths that can guide us through, that may see the world in a way that we don't, that provides us an opportunity to get through and to get out and to either find that new place where we're going to find a new sense of identity, a new sense of purpose, and go forward from there, or will help us to be healed and to find unity and to find ways of being reconciled so that we go forward together. This is what God is calling us to. That's the message that we need to take out to the world around us, is to say, when you pray, first things first, pray that we have the patience to stop and to listen to what God is trying to tell us. And then to stop and to listen to the folks that God puts around us. Because together we are stronger. Together we can see this new path that God is putting in front of us, that we can find a way through. But we have to come together. We have to find ourselves, and we have to be able to listen to one another. As we go into this next week and the coming weeks and months and years, because this is not going to be a short process. Remember, I talked about that long arc that the church went through before we came back together. We're in that same process. It is going to be a long arc as we work through this. But if we remember our help, then God will bring us through. And we will come through on the other side, maybe in a new place. That's always an option. But also, we can also be in a place where we are brought back together and we find that unity and that identity together with one another as we go forward from here. Let us go and share that message with a world that needs to hear it. And let us do that in Christ's name.